Okay, so chapter 3, um, From System Effectiveness to System Improvement, Reform Paradigms and Relationships by Sir Michael Barber. Um, Barber basically sets out here in this chapter to establish three paradigms that um, can be used to reform public services in general, but for our purposes and for his purposes in this chapter, we're going to focus on education. So, on the outside of this infographic here, you'll see the three main targets here for um, paradigm reform or change. First one is command and control. Command and control is basically the idea that the government or leadership from the government plays the sole role for developing the change that is necessary. They establish the goals. They are the quote unquote dictator of this system. The second one over here on the right, quasi markets. Quasi markets is this idea of a partnership between private and public sectors that come together, that create a relationship that eventually lead to the change that we're looking for. And this final one here in the middle, devolution and transparency. These two, this goes from, we might say this as the grassroots level, change at the local level, or in education's sake, maybe at the school level, at the individual school level, with maybe a principal leading the change. Barber basically establishes that there are some things that a government needs to provide, that education requires government to provide. The first one of those, the first three of those are capability, capacity, and culture. That the government provides these three things, and those cannot necessarily be provided by any other entity. The other two things that the government provide are labeled here: performance management and strategic direction. Uh, Performance management is the idea that the government can provide data to those receiving education. We'll call those the clients or the customers, the parents and the students. We can provide data to determine if we're being if we have an effective educational system. That's performance management. And the final thing that governments can do is they can provide the direction, strategically, specifically. How do we move forward without losing our way? How do we create multiple pathways forward? So those are the things that the government can provide, and they provide those things through these three paradigms. So the idea becomes, well, what paradigm do you use and when? So, and the other thing is why? Why do you need to? So we need to use one of these paradigms based off of where we're at and what type of change our system needs. If we have a system that requires radical change, then you're going to experience a system that requires more command and control. If we require less radical change, then we may find ourselves somewhere in between these two areas. Okay, so in education, Barber basically refers back to this idea that reform cannot take place without teachers. So in order for education to be reformed, we have to get the teachers on board. I'm reading this from a Kindle, so I'm gonna use my Kindle references here. On page 81, he describes this process as it's basically a system where governments team up with teachers in order to create that change. And the reason that we need to team with teachers is that teachers are the front line. And he says here, well-motivated teachers do a better job. And it's his assertion that, and he doesn't explicitly state this, but his assertion is simply basically that when we give them a framework or a goal, that they will become more motivated from this. And that motivation will increase the overall productivity of their students and their ability to learn. Because remember that the teachers and the students are the customers, and they want change. They need change. So how do we get teachers on board? Well, Barber proposes that there's three basic problems that we'll experience, and three things that we can do to overcome this. The first thing is communication from the government to the teachers about how and why the change is taking place. The second thing is and he describes this through his Ontario example that we'll get into later in some of my next videos, but you have to build a coalition between all the stakeholders, whether that's parents, students, teachers, curriculum developers, teacher unions. All of these people need to be brought into a coalition that agrees with the change and understands why we're heading in that direction. The final problem that we're going to face, and that education faces when creating change, is that it's hard to be consistent and it's hard to be reliable across schools. So in order to provide an equitable system, we have to provide a system that is the same for everyone. And so when we create a system where there's some that have and there's some that do not have, that inequitability will never lead to a close in the performance gap that we see. So got some resources for you here as well as we look at this. So it's a great little website where you can check out changewars.weebly.com. Provides some summaries of our chapters. So as we look through what other people have summarized, we can see this command and control mechanism. And let me zoom in here for you. Under these three paradigms, you can see what we have in terms of combining these, whether it's through quasi-markets and the transparency model, that these things can be combined. But that the government plays these three key roles in identifying and addressing the change. What is not explicitly stated here that I have to comment on is that Barber believes that in order to move schools through his 4 stages, what he calls awful schools, adequate schools, good schools, and great schools, that these 4 stages, in order to move through these 4 stages, that we simply would just address data, and that we would just measure student growth based off of arbitrary testing or high stakes testing, and then we would just compare growth, and that determines the measure of success. So understand that what Barber is proposing here is that schools be measured on data determined by the government, and then that data will be used in order to create a system that determines if we're good, great, awful, or adequate. So those measures may not necessarily be what you would determine a school to be a good school or a great school or an adequate school. So these are simply stated that at a command and control paradigm, the government determines what is a good or what is a great school or what is an awful school. And so those things may be very different for different users. So something that I really think that we need to keep in mind as you read this chapter and as you understand it. So some other things here are underneath this video. I hope you click on the next video, which is actually Sir Michael Barber describing or summarizing his thought process as far as change. And is what you will probably find out, and is what he slightly gets into in this chapter, is all of these things that we're talking about here, mainly this model here, is all about how you change. And he's not just talking about why you change or when you change, but he is under the impression that he is describing here the how. And in his mind, change is created by the government, as you can see on these outside things, through one of these 3 models. So how we change is through one of these, and depending on which one our government takes on, and he gives some examples of all 3 successes and some failures as well. But his assertion is simply that we change schools by the government. And so I'll let you decide if you believe that that is the case or if that's true. Don't forget that you can always go back and vote on the poll at the top of the website. So see what you say.